So, welcome everyone from wherever you are in the world. A number of you are from the United States joining us today. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian here. I'm the host of this program. This webinar today is part of an ongoing series by the LSE Hayek program hosted by the Research Institute Stickett at the London School of Economics. The aim of this online webinar series is to explore a range of interdisciplinary topics that are related in some way to the intellectual contributions of the economist F.A. Hayek. These include individualism and economic freedom, the nature and future of liberal democracy, social justice and welfare, decision-making under radical uncertainty, macroeconomic management, the rule of law and justice, and many others. Today, we are very pleased to have with us Dr. Marcus Witcher, who is an assistant professor of history at Huntington College, and Professor Rachel Ferguson, director of the Free Enterprise Center at Concordia University, Chicago, assistant dean of the College of Business, professor of business ethics. Both of them will be speaking the topic today titled Black Entrepreneurship, Building the Foundation for Freedom, which is based on a book they have co-authored titled Black Liberation Through the Marketplace, Hope, Heartbreak, and the Promise of America. We're going to drop that in the chat later for everyone. In the talk, the speakers will discuss the efforts of Black businessmen and women, entrepreneurs, mutual aid societies, and voluntary organizations in creating networks of Black Americans that contributed to the success of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. They'll be speaking for approximately 40 to 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A lasting approximately 30 minutes. You may drop your questions anytime over the course of the presentation in the Q&A function below. As the host, I'll be holding on to these questions and I'll begin posing them to our speakers at the end. Please do note that this session is recorded and will be up on YouTube, and it will be available for viewing on YouTube after the next few days. So without further ado, let me hand the time over to our speakers, Marcus and Rachel.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm going to start us out as the lead author on the book. I'll sort of frame out our approach to this whole project. And then Marcus did the really deep dive into Black entrepreneurship. So he'll talk for the rest of the time. I just want to start by saying that we are coming from the perspective of classical liberalism. Of course, F.A. Hayek is famous for being one of the major thinkers in 20th century classical liberalism. And what do we mean by that? Well, we explain that very simply by talking about five basic ideas, three institutions and two concepts. So one institution that classical liberals really value is private property. We see the importance really to people's human dignity, that they own themselves. I own my labor and I can exchange it, and I can exchange it for possessions, which I then also own, and I can use my will and my creativity with those possessions to do amazing things. And so it's very important that we honor the institution of private property. We also need to honor the institution of right to contract, freedom of contract, meaning that once I have my possessions that I've come to own, I need to be able to exchange them with the people that I choose to, and make deals and trades, and also open businesses, right? And start things, start creative endeavors. So much of what we do in the marketplace is actually cooperation, not competition, right? It's getting together and working together. And so that's also a part of my human dignity, is being able to express my creativity through my cooperation with others. And then finally, of course, we look at the institution of the rule of just laws and the equal protection of the rule of just laws applied equally across all of the citizens, neutrally considered. And so, of course, this is incredibly important. And we can see this in development economics, right? We can see the cases where, because of the lack of the rule of just law, you get a lack of trust, you get a kind of freezing up, an unwillingness to enter into all of those creative efforts and deals and business ideas, because you're not safe, right? If something goes wrong, they can just bribe the judge or something like that. You can see how things can really freeze up and not develop economically when you don't have that reliable court system and reliable rule of law. So those three institutions are just absolutely fundamental to a flourishing society. But let's not forget, that's all really your political infrastructure, right? but there's so much more to life than politics. And so one thing we really love is markets. So that's a major classical liberal commitment, is to the free market. We're living in an amazing time, right? We're living in a time in which abject poverty across the world has been reduced to just 8%. It's an absolute miracle. We should be having parades in the streets, but we don't, because there's just another 135,000 people coming out of abject poverty every day. And that would be the same thing on the front page every day if we approached it that way. But actually, it really is such a fantastic time to be alive. And that's because of the rise of global markets. And so what we're seeing is even the Brookings Institution talks about how all across the world, we've actually reached over 50% of the world's population is now living in the middle class within their own economy. That's a huge plummeting of inequality across the world. It's not news you often hear, but it's true. And you can check me on Our World in Data, gapminder.org, other websites like that. So we're very excited about what markets can do, and classical liberals always have been. And then finally, we really care about civil society institutions. And that's because, of course, if we are mostly going to be concerned with these fundamental institutions of private property, freedom of contract, and rule of law, we're not actually running your life, from the level of the government in any other way. We're providing an infrastructure for you to run your life and for you to create communities that pursue their vision of the good life together. And so if we're not going to be ruled by the state, then we have to rule ourselves. And it's so important that we have these horizontal relationships in civil society. And that can be family, that can be church, that can be clubs, that can be educational institutions, nonprofits. We could go on and on and on. There's so many things that come under that umbrella, but it's really the stuff of life. That's what really makes up what's important to us in our lives, is our civil society relationships. And so I open up with this little summary of classical liberalism because there's a very sort of polarizing assumption when it comes to race in America. And that is that if you care about the terrible oppression that Black Americans did endure in our history and still suffer from the effects of today, then you must be sort of a big government person. You might be a capital P progressive, someone who wants to do a lot of state intervention in order to address these issues. And then, of course, the opposite pole on that polarizing view is that if you are a small government person, like a classical liberal like ourselves, maybe you don't care much, right? Because, hey, you're not willing to intervene coercively. And so maybe this isn't something that matters enough to you. And maybe you're not interested in Black history. And maybe you're just insensitive to the plight of Black Americans. And what we wanted to show in the book is actually quite the opposite is true, even just as a matter of historical fact. And so it's not just that you can possibly outline a position that is both small government and pro-Black, but that actually people did it. The most important strand of abolitionism in American history was led by William Lloyd Garrison and, of course, his amazing student, Frederick Douglass. These were wildly small government, free market people. Frederick Douglass was famous for fighting for free trade for the Irish, right? And so that they could have cheap food for peasants. They loved him for that. They called him the Black O'Connell, right? He was very famous following Richard Cobden, for those of you who know about economic history in England, right? Richard Cobden and the Anti-Corn Law League, they were both against tariffs and against slavery. They saw it all as part of one big philosophy of freedom. And then you can go on and talk about several co-founders of the NAACP, one of the mothers of libertarianism, Rose Wilder Lane, who wrote passionately for Black rights in the Pittsburgh Courier, the great Black novelist Zora Neale Hurston. There's so many amazing examples of this small government pro-Black kind of position. And so not only did it exist concretely, but we also know that the classical liberal scholars have looked very deeply into questions of race and discrimination, and even won Nobel Prizes for their insights into race and discrimination, like Gary Becker. And so what we want to do is draw all of those insights and that history together to present this third way to bust out of this tribal polarized idea of what it takes to address race in America well and present something totally different. And so we emphasize many important civil society institutions, the Black Church, Black fraternal associations. You're going to hear from Marcus about the National Negro Business League. We see how Black Americans leaped forward with regard to literacy because of their just amazing horizontal relationships and just very thick civil society institutions. And we also note that the Black American population today is still very much in line with what we're describing. They are the most centrist of Democrats, along with Latinos, often highly, highly entrepreneurial, deeply religious, the most likely people in the United States to believe in God, to pray, to be even socially conservative on many issues. And so there's a lot about Black America that isn't necessarily represented well by those in academia who claim to speak for Black America. And so we try to get down to a more maybe accurate representation, and one that opens up lots of possibilities for solutions moving forward between Blacks and whites in the United States. So I'll stop there and let Marcus take over. Thanks.
Awesome. That's a great introduction, Rachel. It's always great to share sort of the stage with Rachel. We don't always get the opportunity to. We've done a ton of events, but only a handful together because we're in different parts of the country. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I do have a PowerPoint that I'm going to sort of go through. And to pivot sort of and connect, if you will, to what Rachel had to say is what we're presenting here today in this talk is one chapter from the book, chapter 6. And that's the chapter about Black entrepreneurship. But in many ways, I think it's one of the most important chapters of the book because it demonstrates how Black Americans embraced market capitalism and civil society as a means by which to empower themselves to fight systemic racism, oftentimes promoted at the state level, right, at the governmental level. And so that's the story that I'm going to sort of tell you today. It's the argument that we make in the chapter is that far from sort of markets being contrary to Black Americans' liberation, indeed, Black Americans used the marketplace to build a foundation of economic power that then they drew upon in order to force the government and others to grant them equality and civil rights. And that's the story that I'm going to tell today. I want to begin by discussing just briefly, in 1895, Black Americans attempted to boycott the streetcars. They attempted to boycott streetcars across the United States from 1895 to roughly 1903 or so. Series of boycotts. Booker T. Washington was very much in support of these. They ultimately, though, were not successful at bringing about political change. Some of the local businesses did change their practices when they were allowed to do so by the local governments, but by and large, in 1895, Black Americans failed to desegregate public facilities. Why then were Black Americans successful 60 years later when Rosa Parks, right, famously refused to give up her seat in Montgomery, Alabama? That's one of the central questions for today, and the answer lies in Black Americans using the marketplace, being entrepreneurial, building businesses, building civil societies to form the foundation so that in 1955, right, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Montgomery bus boycott can be successful. So that's the story that we're going to tell. We're going to talk about a period of American civil rights history that I think is often neglected, but I think is absolutely essential in understanding how Black Americans gained their freedom. Let's begin. Before we can jump into what I think is a really positive and hopeful talk, we have to sort of set the stage, and we have to understand, all of us who are in this Zoom and who are online, that in the 1880s and in the 1890s, after slavery was abolished in 1865, there was a brief period of time called Reconstruction, where the United States attempted to put the country back together after the Civil War and also protect Black American civil liberties. It was brief, and by 1873 or so, federal troops had withdrawn from the American South, and in most states have largely left those states under the control of what were called Redeemer Southern Democrats, who wanted to reinstitute sort of racism and are going to form and pass into law a variety of different pieces of legislation that are going to systematically disenfranchise Black Americans again, to put them in a situation that's been described by some as slavery by another name. During this time, scientific racism is dominant, supported, I might add, by many of the elite sort of progressive intellectuals at the time. And we see what we see emerge across the South from 1863 up until, all the way up until the 1900s or so, is a system of legislations that is being passed by the state governments. Of course, Jim Crow is part of that. Most of us are aware of Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruling that declared that separate was equal in sort of train cars, right? Which set the stage for Jim Crow laws across the South. But there are other aspects that we're not aware of. Laws like the Peg laws that, basically made felonies things that had been misdemeanors prior to. And what emerged out of that was a system of convict leasing in which oftentimes, disproportionately, Black men were arrested, thrown in jail, and then the state governments and local governments would then lease these convicts to private corporations in order to increase the state government's revenues. So what Booker T. Washington is facing in the 1880s and the 1890s is a culture and a society dedicated to racism, in which most of the intellectuals in the United States are embracing some form of white supremacy, a political situation where Republicans just simply don't have the political capital to really do anything for Black Americans in the South, and oftentimes are unwilling to try. It is a really, really desperate time. And most Americans, many Americans at the time, believed that Blacks were fundamentally inferior and that if left to their own devices, they would die out on their own. I mean, I can't really overstate how difficult things must have been for Booker T. Washington when he got the invitation to go to the Tuskegee Institute in 1881. The Tuskegee Institute, for those of you who may not know, is located just east of Montgomery, Alabama. Okay, so actually just east of where I am right now, maybe about 50 miles or so. It's in the heart of Dixie, if you will, right? And the Tuskegee Institute was established by the state of Alabama. They were aware that they were in massive violation of sort of like providing any semblance of education for Black Alabamians. And so they provided a small amount of money and land through the legislature to create basically a normal school for Black Alabamians. And what a normal school would have been back then was basically a school to teach teachers, They wanted a white man to come down and run the school, but when they reached out to the Hampton Institute in Virginia to ask them if they had any recommendations for a good white man to be the president of this college in Montgomery, Alabama, or outside of Montgomery, Alabama, the Hampton Institute, they responded by saying, no, but we do have this guy named Booker T. Washington. We think he would be perfect for you. And so in 1881, Booker T. Washington agrees, travels down to Alabama. He had lived in West Virginia after his family they moved north after escaping, after slavery had ended. And he returns to the South and he encounters this climate that I've described to you in the first slide. And he arrives at Tuskegee's, the sort of college itself, and it's literally one building, a plantation home, and a bunch of land. There aren't classrooms, there aren't dorms. And so the first year they recruit students come to learn how to be teachers. And the students actually, the way in which they paid part of their tuition, or most of their tuition, was by working with the faculty to actually build Tuskegee from the ground up. It's an amazing story. I highly recommend it to you guys. Basically, they, with their own hands, came up with a formula to make the bricks. And after their third time, were successful in creating bricks that could actually work properly. And they literally built their first classroom, the students, the faculty, the staff, Booker T. Washington himself, and then they invited people from all over Alabama, Black people from all over Alabama, to come and see what Black hands had built. And Booker T. Washington told the people who came to Tuskegee, he said, look at what we can achieve. People who say we're inferior are wrong, right? Black hands built this building, and Black hands are going to build this school. We are capable, despite the narrative that we were faced with, right, in the 1880s and the 1890s. Washington goes on to be an extraordinarily successful, training largely teachers to go back into Alabama to educate the young, right? And these teachers are facing all types of challenges, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But he's also, Booker T. Washington is a builder, okay? And he's involved in building what we call civil society institutions almost from the beginning of his time in Tuskegee, he says, wow, we've got all these teachers that we're churning out, but they're all facing all these challenges. Maybe what we should do is bring them together and let them talk with one another about how they overcame, right? Having one classroom for all the children in your community, 18 years to 5 years old, right? How do you grapple with that when you're the only school teacher and you have no real books, materials, help, resources, etc.? And so to that effect, he founded the Alabama State Teachers Association, which was the first teachers association in Alabama, and I believe in the country. He took that idea and expanded it in 1892 by founding the Tuskegee Negro Conference, which brought everyday Black people from across Alabama together to try and discuss strategies for improvement. Nobody else is helping us, right? Is basically the message. So we have to help each other through this. We have to help each other. What works for you in terms of planting? Have you thought about terracing? Have you, heard about these new techniques, right, to farm? Hey, you're really interested in creating a business. I know a banker, a Black banker, has some capital. Pairing people together so they have the networks necessary to try and improve their communities from the ground up. In the middle of the 1890s, Booker T. Washington becomes the quote-unquote leader of his race. This had been a role that had been filled by Frederick Douglass, basically, before the Civil War, but definitely after the Civil War. Frederick Douglass becomes the most sort of outspoken spokesman for Black Americans. And after Douglass's death, that mantle falls on Booker T. Washington. But Washington faces great challenges in being the person who has to speak for his race. He lives in the heart of Dixie, all right? He lives in Alabama, the capital of the Confederacy, or was the capital of the Confederacy. He faces anger from the KKK, the White Citizen Council. His life is threatened numerous times. And so he struggles to fulfill the expectations of Northern Blacks who think he's not doing enough to speak out for civil liberties and civil rights of Black Americans. I don't want to dwell on this too long, but what I do want to say is that that view was absolutely wrong. Booker T. Washington was fighting behind the scenes to try and combat the state constitutions of Louisiana, Virginia, Alabama, which were being revised in the 1890s to basically strip Black Americans of their civil liberties. He was working behind the scenes, bankrolling some of the legal challenges against those in a tactic that's very similar to what the NAACP would later do. He also is active in paying, he actually pays for W.E.B. DuBois's lawsuit against the Pullman Company, something that DuBois seemingly forgot years later when he criticized Washington for not doing anything to fight for Black civil rights and liberties. He's also involved in a personal relationship, right, with Teddy Roosevelt. He has a good personal relationship with the president, and he uses that personal relationship to get a man by the name of Thomas Good Jones appointed to the courts. And Thomas Good Jones, after just a few years, abolishes the practice of peonage in the South and also helps get rid of the worst practices of convict leasing, even though convict leasing would not be abolished in Alabama. Hurrah, Alabama was the last state to abolish it, and it took them until 1928 to do so. So Booker T. Washington is actually very involved in fighting for Black civil liberties, but he has to be very careful about the way that he does it. Because after his sit down with the president in the White House, literally a man comes and attempts to assassinate him. There's an assassination attempt that doesn't ultimately get carried out against Washington. And so he has his students to be concerned about, which is why he's cautious about sort of political rights and liberties. In 1900, Washington founded the National Negroe Business League, whose goal was to bring Black business leaders, right? So basically, it's very similar to what he had done in Alabama, but expanding it across the United States, bringing them together to promote the commercial and financial development of the Negro. And while Booker T. Washington supported the 1895 street boycotts, he thought that using your economic power was a noble and just way to protest. He really does believe that the path to civil rights and equality lies through the accumulation of wealth by Black Americans and the accumulation of skills that will lead white Americans to recognize that Black Americans are useful, that they are humans who have dignity and can exchange with them, right? And can be useful members of society. He thinks that he can appeal to white Americans' sort of sense of shame. He can shame them. Look, these people are just like you in the long run, right? If Black Americans can become economically mobile etc. And this works to a large extent. This works. If we look at Black incomes from 1873 to 1900, the slope of the line is extraordinarily positive. If you look at Black literacy, Black Americans had a literacy rate of roughly 8% or so at the end of the Civil War, and by the end of the 1930s, that rate's over 80%. It's an incredible leap forward in education and economic well-being, given where Black Americans had to start with virtually no help after Reconstruction. Rachel, we always quote Robert Higgs, who says, this is the greatest leap forward in literacy in the world history, and no one talks about it. It's an amazing accomplishment. And so Booker T. Washington's a builder. He's someone who builds networks. He pulls people together. He creates civil society. And that's what he does in the National Negro Business League. One of the entrepreneurs who joins the National Negro Business League, although she's extraordinarily frustrated with Booker T because she thinks he's a misogynist and won't allow her to speak, which irritates her, is Madam C.J. Walker, okay? And Madam C.J. Walker is another amazing story. I like to tell Madam C.J. Walker's story not because of what she achieved necessarily, although what she achieved was incredible, but because of all the people she empowered along the way. It demonstrates how important entrepreneurship is, not just for the entrepreneur, but also for the culture and the community that entrepreneur then goes on to serve, and to the people who are employed by that entrepreneur and learn skills and then go out and apply those skills to improve themselves. Madam C.J. Walker was born into slavery as Sarah Breedlove. She got pregnant very early in life. She moved to St. Louis. She had a daughter. She spent the first half of her life was spent putting her daughter through school. She worked as a washerwoman, and at some point in her late 30s, early 40s, she looks at herself as she's washing somebody's clothes in the tub, probably some white woman's clothes in the tub, right? And she sees herself reflected, and she goes, "How long am I going to do this? How long am I going to do this? How long can I keep doing this? How long can my body hold up?" Her hair, she has, like many other women at the time, both Black and white, she has issues probably with lice, etc. And her hair is sort of in a condition that she is not pleased with, and she goes out and she seeks a product. She hears about this product by a woman by the name of Annie Malone. She seeks her out. She buys her product. She uses her product, and she has beautiful hair. After 6 months or so of using this, her hair is just absolutely beautiful. And so she goes back actually to Annie Malone and says, "I want to work for you, because what your product has done for me is it's changed my life, and I'm a testimony to how good and how well your product works." Annie Malone brought her on, taught her sort of the tricks of the trade. And a few years later, Madam C.J. Walker, after having supposedly a dream in which she was sort of dreamed up this sort of revised version of Annie Malone's, although Madam C.J. Walker said it was all new, but I'm dubious. She improves on Annie Malone's formula and creates her own beauty care line. And where she's different from Annie Malone is she is a magnificent marketer. Okay, she is great, and she makes her face and her hair the brand. Right, she stamps herself on every single can of stuff that she sells, and she goes around and she starts just doing it herself, her and her husband, and then over time she starts hiring people to go door to door, kind of like Mary Kay today in the United States, selling, chucking and trying to get you to buy products that you don't necessarily want. That's what she did, right? She went door to door trying to sell women's healthcare products, Black women's healthcare products, and it was amazingly successful. She becomes the first female millionaire in the United States. First Black female millionaire, and she buys a home right down the street from John D. Rockefeller. Okay, Rockefeller is her neighbor. They actually see each other on the road, talk to each other frequently, etc. And Rockefeller and Carnegie, by the way, are funding Tuskegee, in case you didn't know. So Madam C.J. Walker becomes a millionaire, incredible life story, donates to the NAACP a large amount of money. She is extraordinarily important in fighting for sort of Black civil liberties through these other organizations. But really, one of the greatest things that she did was she empowered, right? She empowered all those Walker agents, as she called them, to go out and to have a job. Those people who used to be mammies, so they used to be, sort of shoe shiners, or they used to wash clothes. Now, all of a sudden, they are entrepreneurs, right? They're going door to door. They're selling their products. They've learned sort of the way in which to do business. And she even would tell them when they would come up to her factory, which they did once a year, she would lecture to them. She would talk to them about sort of proper techniques and stuff. And she goes, I don't want to see you back here, right? In 3 or 4 years, I want you to go out and I want you to start your own business venture. And I want you to get on your own and be empowered through the market, right? So she's an amazing success story. Another part of the story is, of course, Black mutual aid societies. These societies developed immediately after emancipation, and they are extraordinarily important because they provided social welfare at the time, right? There wasn't healthcare, there wasn't sort of like, short-term disability, other things like that. But they were also extraordinarily important in the South because once Black Americans were disenfranchised, which happened very quickly in the 1870s, 1880s, they provided a place where Black men and women could come and gather and sort of talk about the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence. They could talk about political issues. They could hold positions of power, etc. And importantly, they could pull their resources towards causes that they cared about. Later on in the lecture, when we talk about the NAACP, right, or when you think about Brown v. Board of Education, most of those legal challenges would have been very difficult to mount without the financial support of mutual aid societies just like these. By 1920, more than 2 million Black Americans belonged to mutual aid societies, and they owned more than $22 million worth of property. They also happened to train the first generation of Black lawyers because they had to fight in the courts for their names. White mutual aid societies refused Blacks to be members in their mutual aid societies. And so what did Black Americans do? Well, they formed their own. They formed a chapter of, there's the Elks, which was the white sort of fraternity, but they formed the Black Elks. And what did the White Elks do immediately after that? Sued them, claiming that they had stolen their name. And so they had to train a cadre of young Black lawyers to go out and fight, okay, for those, for basically their IP, their copyright, their ability to have their name. They actually won that court case, and those lawyers ended up being sort of the vanguard of the lawyers who would staff the NAACP once it was founded. Once Booker T. Washington died, the sort of leader of the race did not go to any one person, much to W.E.B. Du Bois's frustration. It did not pass to him. It went to the NAACP. And the NAACP was an organization that was made up of both Black and white Americans who cared deeply about equality before the law, right? Eliminating unjust laws and fighting through the courts, primarily to try and achieve Black liberation. Now, of course, they were dependent upon mutual aid societies, fraternal organizations, right? Black businessmen and women, people like Madam C.J. Walker to give money to their cause, but they're going to try and work through the courts from the 19-teens all the way up until, well, really all the way up to the present. They continue to work, right? But their sort of angle is through the courts. They contained, as Rachel said, right, a large number of classical liberals were a part of the formation of the NAACP, Oswald Garrison Billard being one of those. And of course, they had other people who disagreed with classical liberalism. W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, would become radicalized in the late 1920s, early 1930s and embrace communism. And be largely, I think, unrepentant even after sort of the horrors of Stalinism came to light. But nonetheless, right, it was an organization that wasn't only classical liberal. It was a large conglomeration or a bringing together, right, of people from different political persuasions who wanted to work together, right, to try and overturn these unjust laws and to ensure that the promises of the Declaration and the promises of the Constitution were actually fulfilled, that Black Americans were able to enjoy their individual liberty just like everybody else. I oftentimes do talk about sort of Black Wall Street as an amazing, amazing success story of what Booker T. Washington attempted to do in Tulsa, Oklahoma. That's absolutely true. It is a sort of booming community. Extraordinary amounts of wealth are built there. Beautiful civil society. You're probably aware that in 1921, it was destroyed by a mob of whites who descended into Tulsa or into Greenwood from Tulsa after sort of a racial incident that took place, and they destroyed Greenwood. They burnt it to the ground. And I include these slides, one, to show how amazingly successful Black Americans were at pursuing Washington's approach, but also as a challenge, right, to the Washington approach. because at the end of the day, no one was punished for destroying Greenwood at the time. And so what it shows is that despite, I don't think there's probably anybody on this call who believes in markets more than me, but markets without the protection of property, right? Without sort of the protection of the right to life, liberty, property, are not enough. They can lift you out of poverty. You can create amazing communities. But if a mob can come and destroy what you've built, it's just not enough. So I'm sorry to my ANCAP friends. I'm sorry. It's just not enough. Markets aren't enough, right? To provide the type of flourishing and prosperity, right, that I think all of us would like to see. The reality is that you have to have respect, right? You have to have equal protection under the law, the rule of just law, right? As Rachel said at the beginning of our talk, which was not extended to Black Americans in the 1920s. The 1930s were a rough time for Black Americans, and many policies were passed in the 1930s that came to actually really harm Black Americans. The most sort of egregious example is probably the creation of the Federal Housing Administration, which provides insurance on mortgages, basically to try and encourage more loans to be made. The FHA sounds really good, has good intentions, but part of its policy was to encourage homogenous neighborhoods. I think you can read into that what they meant by that. They meant if a neighborhood is white, we're only going to insure loans to whites. And so the 1930s saw an array of policies in the New Deal that maybe were well-intentioned if we're giving the Roosevelt administration the benefit of the doubt, but ultimately had really, really terrible outcomes for Black Americans. And one of the major discrepancies in wealth today that we see between Black and white Americans, I believe, is the fact that Black Americans were denied home ownership in the United States, largely because the FHA refused to underwrite their loans. So the 1930s were a really hard decade for Black Americans. They struggled like all Americans did. Despite that, during World War II, Black Americans answered the call. All right. We're talking 1.2 million Black men served in the armed forces during World War II. They went abroad, and while they were abroad, right, French women would greet them in towns with little flowers. They'd pin them on them. And Black men had to ask the question, like, why am I fighting a racialized regime, which is what the Nazi fascist regime was? It was a racialized regime. Why am I fighting a racialized regime abroad when I'm going to return to the United States and face a racialized regime in the form of Jim Crow in the South? And so during World War II, they started what was called W.E.B, victory over fascism abroad and victory over Jim Crow and racism at home. And that was the hope, right? Is that World War II would shock white Americans into recognizing the hypocrisy of their stance. It did. It did have that effect on a large number of white Americans. I think the Nazi regime, and what it stood for, its eugenicist programs, etc., those progressive ideas that we talked about in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, right, that dominated academia, those ideas are not going to be in vogue anymore, okay? It took World War II for Americans to recognize that. But after World War II, we're like, okay, no, we don't want to deal with that anymore. Furthermore, tensions in the Cold War are going to put pressure, right, on American presidents to make changes. Black Americans hoped that during World War II, they could bring about significant change. That did not happen. The government actually tried to mitigate racial disorder, if you will. And so after World War II, Black veterans, though, are going to emerge as one of the central components of the civil rights movement, along with, right, the mutual aid societies, the Black entrepreneurs, and of course, the Black church. In August of 1955, a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till came down to Mississippi to visit family from Chicago. And while he was down there, he and his friends went into a local convenience store that was run by a family of whites. And Emmett Till supposedly, although now we know he didn't actually do it, supposedly whistled or said something inappropriate to the cashier, who was a woman. Happens that woman was married. That was the wife of the man who owned the facility. And she told her husband and her brother about what had happened, and they decided they were going to find this young boy who had made sexual advances towards his wife, and they were going to punish him for what he had done because, quote unquote, the black people were getting too uppity in Mississippi after the passage or after the Brown v. Board decision. It was massive sort of backlash, right? In Mississippi, and racial violence increased dramatically. The Emmett Till case is just the most sort of obvious and visible of those cases. So these two men, I think accompanied by a third, showed up at Emmett Till's family home, and they knock on the door in the middle of the night. The door opens. They push past Emmett Till's grandmother, push up the stairs, find Emmett Till, drag him out, throw him in the back of their truck. They drive him to a barn, and they beat him. And they beat him. And they beat him. And then, not being satisfied, they fill his body with bullet holes and dump it into the Tallahatchie River. A couple days go by, and then Emmett Till's body is found. And there's going to be a trial. These two men have been accused of committing the murder. The third's identity is unclear. And so they're going to be put on trial in Mississippi. Emmett Till's body is taken back to Chicago, where his mother has to make a decision. She decides to have an open casket because, as she said, I want the world to see what they did to my boy. And the image over on the right, I apologize for how gruesome it is, but I think it's important that people see these things, especially my students. And she has the open casket funeral, and tens of thousands of people, black and white, go to Emmett Till's funeral, and they see his mutilated body. Photographs are taken of it, and Emmett Till's mother takes those photographs and she sends them to a man named John H. Johnson, who is a wonderful entrepreneur, businessman who has formed a publishing empire in Jet and Ebony magazine. You see now the connections, the importance, right, of these civil society, entrepreneurship, businessmen, etc. She sends these images to John H. Johnson, and she asks him, she says, please publish these. Please publish these in your magazine. Johnson said this was the most difficult decision he ever had to make in his life, whether or not to publish these photographs, because he feared the backlash that would happen if he published them. He ultimately decided to publish those photographs, and those photographs outraged Americans of all colors, but specifically Black Americans. And the rallying call became no more Emmett Tills. No more Emmett Tills. The image on the left is of a forgotten civil rights leader, TRM Howard, who my graduate school advisor, David Beto, who's a great civil rights historian, has written a biography about. He was actually the leader of the civil rights movement in the mid-1950s. He was one of the most prominent civil rights leaders, and he actually takes Emmett Till's mother in, and he stations guards at the doors with machine guns, and basically tells the White Citizen Council and the KKK, come and get her. Good luck. He drives her every day in armed guard to the courthouse to ensure that she gets there safely. And as the trial for Emmett Till's murderers sort of plays out, the all-white jury, right, Americans, sort of Black Americans, hold their breath. What's going to happen? Will this all-white jury convict? Once the sort of deliberations are over, they let the jury go. The jury talks, they deliberate, they discuss, they come back, they issue their verdict. Not guilty. Not guilty. A couple years later, those two men gave an interview in which they told all the gruesome details of what they did to Emmett Till that night. They were paid, I think, the equivalent of about $5,000 or $35,000 or something like that in today's terms for their story. And of course, they could not be retried because of double jeopardy laws. The attendant, right, the convenience store attendant, on her deathbed, told Timothy Tyson, who's wrote a really, really excellent book about Emmett Till, that she made it up, that the initial incident never occurred. TRM Howard, the man who had fought so hard for justice in Mississippi and having been denied it, decides to marshal Black Americans for what he calls a march on Washington. A march on Washington. And he begins speaking all across the country. And one of the places where he's invited to speak is the Dexter Avenue Church in Montgomery, Alabama, literally a stone's throw, and maybe not a stone's throw, okay, like less than a mile from my office in Montgomery, right? is Dr. King's church. And the Reverend there, right, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., has TRM Howard come and tell the story of Emmett Till. And sitting in the pew that night was a middle-aged seamstress, a young middle-aged seamstress, a woman by the name of Rosa Parks. And Rosa Parks, when she was arrested just a week or so later, she said, I had Emmett Till on my mind. And what TRM Howard said that night really, really made a difference. And of course, once Rosa Parks arrested, that is where we normally begin the story about an amazingly successful civil rights movement that ultimately culminated in the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1968 Fair Housing portion of the 1968 Civil Rights Act, all those successes, right? And sometimes my students say, Dr. Witcher, like government liberated Black Americans, to which I have to pause and say, no, Black Americans liberated Black Americans through civil society, through mutual aid, through Black entrepreneurship. They built the foundation upon which successful civil rights movements spring from, right, or build from. And so to return to that initial question, 1895, streetcars, right? Unsuccessful boycott. 1955, Montgomery's going to be successful. Why is it successful? They use their economic power, right, which has been built over 60 years to force, right, justice and equality in Montgomery, Alabama. Brian, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Marcus and Rachel, for this excellent and very inspiring talk. So I encourage all our guests at the moment to feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A function. I will select them, moderate them, and pose them to our speakers. Perhaps let me just begin, throwing a question myself. I have a rather meta question. You ran through, all these excellent details in American history. Sometimes when I talk to people in the United States, and different people, there seems to be this disjoint, right, between the ideals of America and some of the realities that we've seen in history. So on one hand, the Declaration of Independence, the very founding of the United States, has very inspiring ideals of freedom and equality for all. But throughout American history, we have very violent confrontations, dramatic conflicts, even wars fought over issues of race and ethnicity and, the role of minorities. So could you speak a little bit about this inconsistency? Because some people who may be more cynical, right, about Western civilization, Western values would say, actually, it's there is some level of hypocrisy going on, where there's such a gap between the ideals and reality. And they say, if you look at, let's say, the UK, Europe, other countries, there aren't as much of these very violent, dramatic racial conflagrations and conflicts as we have seemed to have seen in the United States, even in recent years, right, in the last 10, 15 years. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the first thing that I would say is that it's something I had to remind my students when I teach African American history, is that the Enlightenment, came up with the arguments against slavery, right? So if we think about for most of human history, slavery was the norm. All right. Most societies had slavery. It existed as an institution. Racial discrimination is very common after, what do you think, Rachel, 1450, 1500, and Black racial discrimination really sort of emerges the mid 1500s or so. And so what is going on here, I think, is that there's a deep history of racism. There's a deep history of slavery that pre-exists the ideals of the American founding. And the American founding does not dispel those ideals. It does not get rid of that sentiment. Although most of the founders did believe that slavery would die out of natural causes. Jefferson, even slaveholders, thought that it was morally wrong, right? And they thought that it would die out in time. They just couldn't quite figure out how to get rid of it at their own time. And yes, some of them were hypocrites, right? In terms of their economic needs trumped their sort of ideals. But they thought it would die out. That changes right after the invention of the cotton gin. And all of a sudden, by the 1820s, 1830s, Southerners are making arguments that slavery and sort of agrarian feudalism is a superior economic and cultural system to American capitalism. And so we see this reemergence of these ideals. And so I think you're right, Brian, to point out that, like, these ideas of racism and discrimination and slavery and inferiority, like, they did not disappear right away, right, with the advent of the American experiment. But what I would push back and say is that what we've seen over the course of the last 250 years or so is that these ideas have been used by, right, abolitionists and by those people who want a more perfect union, right, that actually represents the ideals of the founding. And so that's, I think, what I would say is that the reality is really messy, but it's probably too much to ask, right, of the founding documents to erase, Rachel, I think, says a millennia, right, 2 millennia, 3 millennia of sort of slavery, discrimination, and other things like that. We always like to say, the problem's not our ideals. The problem's that we haven't lived up to our ideals, right? And there has been a really heavy dose of hypocrisy in the United States. Yeah, Rachel, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say, remember, about 10 times as many West Africans were imported into Brazil than were imported into the United States. But we don't think much about that. And part of the reason we don't think much about that is because Brazil wasn't claiming that all men are created equal, right? America was. And so we stand out because of the hypocrisy. And it is interesting to see how many of the founders, John Adams was the head of an abolitionist society. Ben Franklin was a member of an abolitionist society. Many of these men argued explicitly that if slavery remained, it would doom the republic, because a free society is simply incompatible with a slave society, obviously, right? And so they understood that it wouldn't work ultimately. And I think the really confusing part and the nuance that we need to grasp is that racism and the racial nature of slavery in the United States actually became worse over time. That's what's confusing, is that as the abolitionists pushed back against the Southern planter class, the Southern planter class began to invent new reasons why slavery needed to be racialized. So they went back to Aristotle and adopted natural slavery. And then it got even worse after the Civil War, when you had the rise of pseudo-scientific racism, where you really had this idea of these people should just disappear. They should just die out of our society. So strangely, as we were kind of letting go of some of the legal forms of oppression, we were actually upping the ante on the cultural racism. And so it's a very complicated, very difficult problem to unravel. And so I understand why it would be confusing to people, but I do think that there's hope moving forward because of the Black constitutional tradition. You have people like Frederick Douglass saying the Constitution is a great liberty document. The problem was never the Constitution. It was whether or not Americans had honor enough and courage enough to live up to their Constitution, right? And of course, Martin Luther King Jr. says, this is a check and we're bringing our check to the bank, right, to cash the check. You promised us this. And so it's a very powerful, the American tradition of liberal law is a very powerful foundation for Black people to argue for their full participation as citizens. And so, I think where we saw the power of that in the civil rights movement.
And I just want to take a crack at Brian's second part of his question, if I can, about today. I mean, the United States is a multiracial, multi-ethnic, right, civilization, a society. It's a country where, in order, like, you can come to America and become an American, right? Can you go to France and become a Frenchman? I mean, I don't know. Can you go to Turkey and become a Turk? I don't know, but you can come to America and become an American, because what it means to be an American is not racially or ethnically defined. It's not even culturally defined beyond sort of a broad agreement, right, to these sort of liberal sort of ideals that are ingrained within the Constitution and within the Declaration of Independence. And I think there's a reason why revolutionary movements, throughout history, even in Vietnam, right, Ho Chi Minh, right, quotes from the Declaration of Independence and the Rights of Man. But anytime there's a revolutionary movement, they're waving American flags, despite the fact that we do have sort of racial and ethnic tension. And those are issues that we have to grapple with, right, as a society and as a culture and as a civilization. That's one of the things that Rachel and I are trying to help with in this book and through our talks, is because we have to come to an agreement, Americans do, on a common conception of our past. And that's what we're struggling to do over the course of the last 10 years or so, is we have 2 or 3 very different narratives, and nobody can really agree on what the right narrative is, we've tried to provide a narrative that both acknowledges past injustice and recognizes that there's still goodness in America and that the American project is still worth pursuing. And just on other European states, they had ethnic conflicts. They just weren't necessarily racial, right? I can just point you to Ukraine, right? And the Holodomor, and the way the Russians, sort of treated the Ukrainians throughout the years. I understand that Ukraine's its own thing and not a part of Russia, but there's lots of internal ethnic issues there. There are others as well. I think about Spain and sort of its deep Islamic sort of heritage that for a long time was pushed into the sort of the corner or to the shadows. So anyways, yeah, I think I've addressed it now.
Great, thank you. So we have some excellent questions here in the Q&A. Let me just read out the one by Millie Burns and then from James. So Millie asks, are you aware of businessman and philanthropist Julius Rosenwald joining Booker T. Washington and African American communities in the South to build over 5,500 schools for educating African American young people during the early part of the 20th century?
Yeah, Rachel?
I am. Marcus, do you know any?
Yeah.
I know about it. I don't know that I could add any detail to it, but
yeah, and it's extraordinary sort of contribution in terms of like providing the infrastructure, right? Where because state governments across the South were not willing to provide infrastructure for Black education, right? And so it had to be done through philanthropy. And a lot of the people who I don't know a great deal about Julius Rosenwald's story. I know a lot more about Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, of course. But these are the people who Booker T is constantly going up north. He dies early because he has to be on the road all the time, raising money, right, for all the different causes, but also for Tuskegee. And like his greatest contributors were Northern industrialists, right, the quote unquote robber barons who are vilified in our sort of narratives of American history. And there's some things that you can definitely criticize them for. I'm not saying there's not, but the philanthropy, right, by those white industrialists who, many of them were classical liberals as well in terms of their views of the role of the state, were extraordinarily important, right, to helping with that literacy movement.
Yeah, and I'll just say I teach at Concordia University Chicago, which is a Lutheran institution. And Rosa J. Young was a famous Black educator in the South. She started over 50 schools herself. And she went to Booker T. Washington and said, what do? I want to start schools. And he said, I know some Lutherans, they'll help you. And they did, So I think Booker T. Washington's network, I think it's important and a wonderful healing thing to reflect on the fact that many white Americans participated with sacrifice, their own wealth in order to do this, along with Black Americans who were building the schools themselves. It was definitely something that white and Black people did together. And we shouldn't be reticent to say that, right? That's a wonderful thing. And so to this day, we have the Rosa J. Young Foundation, and it's Black Lutheran schools all over the United States. And so that was all because of Booker T. Washington and his amazing network.
Great. So there is a great question here from James, master's student at LSE. So James asks, you've spoken about free market-oriented Black activists like Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, and DuBois. But how did the classical liberals themselves, as they are taught in the Anglo-American Academy, like Hayek, Mises, Bastiat, Hazlitt, view the civil rights movement in the US? Did they discuss the movement? Was there international support for the Black movement in the US from major liberal thinkers?
Yeah, so I can speak on Hayek, and this is maybe a disappointing case, is that Hayek did not talk about or mention Black American civil liberties in his writings, to my knowledge. I asked Bruce Caldwell, Professor Caldwell at Duke University, who I would say is probably the foremost sort of expert in Hayek, probably in the world. I don't think that's an overstatement. Just got done with his, and he said no, like Hayek didn't really talk about those issues. I don't know about Mises. When did Mises pass? When did Mises pass? Does anyone know, just right off the top of their head? Sorry.
Great question.
Milton Friedman
is in the 1970s. Yeah.
Okay, so that's pretty late. So I don't know about Mises. I'm not sure about Mises. Friedman did. Friedman did talk about and was an advocate for civil rights. Of course, Friedman had his own sort of lens, but through which he sort of talked about Black Americans' individual liberty, oftentimes, right, through an economic lens. Ayn Rand is actually really good. I know she's not an economist, but she's actually quite good on Black Americans' civil liberties. She talks about how racism is sort of like the lowest form of collectivism, so it fit nicely in her sort of like worldview. She's not very good on gay rights if you read her writings, but she was quite good on black very much an anti-racist in the sense of like, you know, racism is deplorable. Who else do we have? I think Buchanan was also very much opposed. Of course, Hutt, right?
Yeah, I was going to say Buchanan had his relationship with William Hutt in South Africa, who was thinking deeply about the color line and how to use markets to overcome.
Another person who was deeply, you know, sort of spoke out about Black American civil liberties at the time was Rose Walder Lane, who's one of the three mothers of modern libertarianism, along with Ayn Rand and Isabel Patterson. And I think Isabel Patterson, so I already said Rand, I think Isabel Patterson too was good on civil rights for Black Americans. And then, of course, you have people like Schuyler, who is a Black American libertarian / conservative, who is also obviously quite good on it. So I'm trying to think, like, are there any major figures we've forgotten here, Brian, that we should think about?
This wouldn't be, I would just say this wouldn't be an academic, but it might help get to a certain pain point. If we talk about Barry Goldwater. So Barry Goldwater is a senator from Arizona. He ran for president, lost. He voted against the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It's really important for people to understand it. And he's known as a very kind of libertarianish politician, right? Barry Goldwater was totally pro-civil rights. He voted for everything up to that point, up to 1964. He actually integrated the cafeteria, the Senate cafeteria, because the head of his own office was a Black woman, and he wanted her to be able to have lunch with her coworkers. And he had a wonderful relationship with the Native Americans in Arizona, very, very trusting relationship between him and them. And so he was very good on racial matters in general. He was concerned just about those few articles in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which seemed to violate perhaps property rights, right? People's being forced to trade with whomever, as opposed to being able to decide themselves. He later regretted that. He felt that he was advised wrongly, and he was advised by a future Supreme Court justice that it was unconstitutional. So he was, you know, trying to stick to the Constitution. And I think that we can make a couple of different arguments about that. We can say that that actually going back in the natural law tradition, people who had shops actually did have to serve everyone. That actually was never really that strict notion of property rights that I have 100% total control over everything I do, doesn't quite line up with our actual experience of the tradition. And so we could say that, or we could say, and I think this is important to consider, all along the way, all the way back to the founders, right? We were told that if we were vicious in the use of our rights, we would lose them, right? That a free society requires a certain level of virtue. And if you want to just keep on and keep on and keep on abusing people with the rights that you have, you will lose them. And if you want to consider people to have lost their right to free exchange because of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, you might say, well, then you shouldn't have stopped Black people from being able to even do business in the South, right? And be able to travel from state to state without having to sleep in their cars. Okay, that's on you then, because you lost that right. So there's a couple of different ways to think about it, but you can see people like Goldwater very forward thinking on race, trying to do it in a constitutional way, and then struggling with the sense in which you know, we can move forward within the boundaries of the Constitution.
Great, thank you. So perhaps just a closing question from me, a final one. So looking at the current, you know, climate of opinion today, you know, issues of race is extremely polarizing. And this perspective of classical liberalism, which you have presented here, isn't really perceived very favorably, you know, by many people when it comes to these issues. You know, what do you see, you know, in the current landscape, you know, and are there some specific areas that you think really classical liberalism can really make a big policy impact, perhaps, for example, maybe, I don't know, criminal justice reform, welfare policy? Are there some specific areas that you think, you know, there are some really strong points that, you know, that stem from your perspective that really speak to the current situation? And perhaps we'll end with this.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things that we tried to do with the book is we never wanted to write a book in which we didn't offer any prescriptions, right? We're like, oh, here's all the problems, right? And so each chapter actually ends with a different solution that oftentimes that people can actually engage in themselves. And I'll let Rachel talk about a couple of those here after I sort of give you my answer to this. Obviously, ending the war on drugs is essential to this, right? We have to stop locking up disproportionately Black men, right, and taking them out of the home. We have to pivot to a rehabilitation model instead of an incarceration model in the United States. It's very difficult to call ourselves the land of the free when we lock up more people than any other country on earth, with maybe the exception of China because of the internment of Uyghurs, right, in internment camps. But with maybe that exception, right? That's not if you have to have that as a caveat, like that's not good. We need to stop locking up Black men in disproportionate numbers, because if you really care about families, right, like it is really difficult, right, to have community and family and to raise kids, right, if one parent is pulled out of the home. So we've got to stop that. Another thing that I am extraordinarily passionate about is school choice. It's a movement that has really taken off in the United States over the course of the last 4 years. And what this is historically, Black children disproportionately have been ghettoized. They've been put into ghettos by federal government policies, whether it's the running of the highways through their neighborhoods, which cut them off from the rest of the city, whether it's the FHA and redlining policies. And so we have large numbers of people, many people of color, who are trapped in neighborhoods that are a product of terrible and oppressive government policies. And now they're forced to go to schools that are failing their children. And so you don't talk about systemic racism. We need to give those parents choice. We need to give those parents their tax dollars and let those parents take their kids to the school of their choosing. Hypothetically, right, we empower parents. This will increase competition. It will increase their options, and it will empower parents who ultimately do know their students, right? They know their kids better than we do, to send their kids to get the best education possible. So those two are really big. And then the third one is something people can do at their own local level, which is go down and next time there's an attempt to build an apartment complex in your town, go down and support it. All right, go down and support it, because you know what? Like, we need low cost housing in the United States. We have a housing crisis in many blue, to be quite frank, democratically led cities, because their zoning laws are just absolutely horrific. They don't allow high density housing to be built. And so as a result, we have a homelessness crisis. Supply is not the only answer to that problem, but it is a large part of the answer to that problem. So those would be the three issues for me that I think would be really, really important, and three issues that classical liberals, right, are extraordinarily good on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we should also talk about various ways in which we can increase economic freedom. And, so much of maybe the top down or central planning kind of mindset is that, we're going to give something to you. But I'll never forget talking to a formerly incarcerated person who said, when I got out of prison, there were so many people who wanted to give me an apartment and give me food and give me clothes, but I wanted to give those things to myself, and no one would help me do that. Right? In other words, he wanted it to work, which is a dignifying thing for every human person. And so what we want to do is get the obstacles out of the way for those people who are trying to work, who are trying to start their own businesses, and reduce the number of silly hoops that they have to jump through in order to do that. Because if you're a middle income person, it's very, very annoying to do those things, but maybe you can pull it off. If you're a lower income person, you may not simply have the time or the bandwidth or the networks to deal with all of these legal requirements. And so taking away things like a lot of occupational licensing requirements, why does a barber have to have a high school diploma? He shouldn't. Right? Why do you have to go to cosmetology school to braid hair? You don't. Right? A lot of these things are just little versions of cronyism, right? They're established businesses who try to put things in the way of others so that they don't have the competition. And that's just corruption, right? I mean, coming right down to it. And so we need to stand up against it and say, no, these poor entrepreneurs need to be free. So I think that's really important. And then the last one we talk about is that civil society emphasis that classical liberals have. Man, there's great stuff coming out on this, by the way, guys. I just today reviewed a book called Fragile Neighborhoods by Seth Kaplan, and he's just pulling in all of these insights that we've been getting on what we call neighborhood stabilization. So what do you do after all of these terrible federal policies and all of this painful racial history has caused a certain neighborhood to become totally destabilized? It's really hard. It's a very, very hard, painful situation for people to be in. And they don't have one problem, they've got 10, right? There's a lot of problems when you're in an inner city neighborhood. And so what we see with neighborhood stabilization is kind of a critique of the way that we often do philanthropy, which is very much a handout mentality. You don't have anything to offer me. I've got the solution. I'll bring the solution to you. It's a very superior kind of attitude. And rather than having that sort of an attitude, having much more of a personal presence, you have the solution for your life. You have the solution for your neighborhood. I want to empower you. I want to network you. I want to listen to you, listen to your voice, and let other people hear your voice, right? So that you can accomplish the things in your neighborhood that you dream about. And we're seeing major successes all over the country in places like Atlanta with focused community strategies, the Christian Community Development Association, Bob Woodson in Washington, D.C. Just amazing, amazing work empowering people, getting them into ownership, getting them into work, into entrepreneurship, etc. And we're understanding more and more deeply how to do this well, how to increase people's horizontal connections so that they have that really strong civil society background, and they can try some things and fail and still be able to get up again and try again until they succeed. And so it's very exciting, but it's very hard work. And it's something we're thinking about deeply. I've written about it in quite a few places. You can look that up. But a good one is Saving St. Louis One Block at a Time at Religion and Liberty, if you're interested in the topic of neighborhood stabilization.
Thank you very much, Rachel and Marcus, for the fantastic talk, your answers to the questions. Ladies and gentlemen, feel free to check out their great book, Black Liberation Through the Marketplace. The link's in the chat. Future events, the link is also in the chat. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending this talk, to our guest speakers as well. This is recorded and will be put up on YouTube within the next 1 week.
Thanks,
All right, thank you
Brian.
for
This
having
was
us.
great.
Rachel and Marcus, fantastic, excellent.
Thanks.
Bye.